Greetings, this is Greg. How quick is a Fiat 124 Spider in the quarter mile? How much quicker is a modded 124 Spider in the quarter mile? I have no illusions about being able to offer a conclusive end to any debate on this subject, but I do have some solid data I'd like to throw out there. Let's start off with a stock car. This is pretty easy since magazines publish times they establish in testing, and for the most part they're pretty consistent. Magazine times do tend to be a little quicker than the average Joe who takes his car to the drag strip, but they're still good times to work from. A dead stock Fiat 124 Spider with an automatic transmission runs the quarter mile in 15.3 seconds at 91 miles per hour, according to Car and Driver. Now, if the quarter mile is really important to you and you want a 124, then you probably shouldn't buy a 124 automatic. You should buy a 124 Abarth with a manual transmission. The 124 Abarth, tested by the same magazine, runs the quarter mile in 14.8 seconds, which puts it about 5 car lengths ahead of its slower stablemate. Those 5 car lengths, or half second in the quarter mile, are going to be hard to make up. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the 124 automatic. It has a lot of advantages over the manual cars. Based on sales numbers, it's clear a lot of others like the automatic as well. With average drivers in most conditions, its performance will be right in the same ballpark as the manual car. However, if the quarter mile is your primary focus, then it's not a good option in this car. Before we go any farther, I need to discuss just how magazines do these tests. The dilemma is that a car tested in Michigan in winter will outperform an identical car tested in Death Valley in July. Heat and other atmospheric variables play a big part in this. So the magazines have to have a way to adjust for this, and so do we. Motor Trend has a good article on just how they do it. Most of the other major US magazines do it pretty much the same way, but this example's from Motor Trend, just because it was easy to find on the internet. Here, you can see that a Dodge Durango tested in California ran the quarter mile in 15 seconds flat. When tested in Michigan, due to the advantageous conditions, it ran it in 14.5. However, when they correct the times for the different conditions, both times correct to 14.9. This is a really important thing to keep in mind when looking at time slips. Back to the 124. Why is the 124 Abarth manual quicker? There are a few reasons. First of all, the automatic isn't a performance type unit. It's pretty good, but there's a certain amount of slippage in it. The flywheel has extra weight attached to it in the form of a fluid-filled torque converter, and the automatic option itself adds about 90 pounds of weight to the car's total. Second, the Abarth has more grip from its slightly bigger tires, and it has a limited slip differential. We know that the tires and limited slip account for about 0.2 of a second in the quarter mile because the manual transmission 124s are about that much slower than manual 124 Abarths in magazine testing. How much of that is the tires and how much of that is the limited slip is hard to guess, but I'm going to say for purposes of this discussion, I'll split it 50-50. 1/10 is the tires, 1/10 is the limited slip. My car has tires that are equivalent of a 124 Abarths, so instead of considering my car in stock form a half second slower than a manual Abarth, I'm going to say it's probably 0.4 of a second slower in stock form. So how quick is my car with its mods? Well, it ran a 14.621 at 95 miles per hour without any corrections. So what were the conditions of this test? My car has phase 2 tune, intake, intercooler, the aforementioned Abarth equivalent wheels and tires, and that's it. It has a fully stock exhaust, stock turbo, runs on 91 octane pump gasoline. The testing was done at the Tulsa drag strip, and the conditions were as follows. According to the drag times database, it was 71 degrees with a humidity of 61% and a pressure of 29.79 inches. Once those numbers are plugged in to the drag times calculator, the link for which is below, the numbers come out like this. The density altitude is shown as 1,901 feet. The corrected times are listed below. Now there are 3 choices, and none of the descriptions accurately describe my car. I have a mildly modified turbo car, and that's not an option here. It is turbocharged, and it is mildly modified, so I suggest that splitting the difference between the high and low numbers here seems quite reasonable based on the descriptions I'm reading, which would put my car's corrected numbers at about 14.4 and 95.8 miles per hour. Of course, I put up the actual time slip with the time and date, so you guys are free to put these numbers into whatever calculators you want to and come up with whatever conclusions you feel are right. But in any case, when you consider that stock my car does 15.3, then 14.4 is a huge improvement. Is this the best my car can do? I doubt it. I think everyone who goes to the drag strip leaves feeling like it could have done more. I launched it with traction control on. I loaded the torque converter up to about 2100 RPM before releasing the brake. I didn't heat the tires up before the run. The car had a little more than 5/8 of a tank of fuel. I'm a big guy. I weigh 236 pounds, so that's not helping things. Perhaps with a quarter tank, a lighter driver, and by playing with air pressure in the tires, a little quicker time would have been possible, but I'm just speculating there. While at the drag strip, my car was sold. Ironically, I'd had it up for sale for a long time, but it happened to sell that exact evening. So I no longer own the car, and I already miss it. It's going to be replaced with a manual car, and at some point in the future, I plan to go back to the drag strip, hopefully much sooner rather than later. I want to stress that taking a 124 to the drags was a lot of fun. It got grouped in with Dodge Chargers and Challengers, mostly V6 models, one older 5.7 automatic, along with a V8 pickup and some other cars. The Fiat was hugely underestimated and beat every single car it was lined up against. Obviously, there were much, much faster cars there, but they were grouped in such a way that the groupings worked out favorably for the little Spider. One thing I learned, or perhaps relearned, since the last time I was at the drag strip was about 30 years ago, is that there's quite a bit of skill involved, even with a relatively low-powered car and an automatic transmission. With the helmet on, all the noise from the staging area and the car next to you, it's tough to hear any tire noise. On the street, I feel like I'm very in tune with what's going on with the car and the tires. But at the track, I found that you have to do things more by feel and use visual cues, since your chances of hearing tire squeal are about zero. So, there are also a lot of other variables to play with. I'm not yet sure if using the traction control was a good plan or not. I left the transmission in automatic mode and let it do its own thing. For those that don't know, that causes the transmission to shift at about 62, maybe 6250 RPM instead of 6500. Was that a mistake? I'm not really sure. It would take several trips to the drags to get all this dialed in. My overall takeaway was that while we already knew that the 124 isn't really a drag race car, it did pretty well and it was a lot of fun at this event. I really look forward to doing it again. So why am I bothering to make this video? Well, it's largely because there have been some attacks directed at me and my company about quarter-mile times and dyno results. This doesn't bother me, but at some point I have to respond or it looks like I'm ignoring the subject and not the accuser. The claim made is that since one of our customer cars did a 14.5 quarter mile, then that means that it's a 170 wheel horsepower car. That's an untrue statement. The idea that you can calculate horsepower from a quarter mile time is a bit misunderstood. It is true to say that a certain quarter mile time in a car of a certain weight requires a certain amount of power. In fact, that's pretty close to describing what horsepower is actually measuring. In other words, it's true to say that a 3,000-pound car requires a minimum of X horsepower to run a 15-second quarter mile. Where this falls apart is when you try and do it in reverse. Just because that 3,000-pound car only runs the quarter in 15 seconds doesn't mean it only has X horsepower. There are numerous reasons for this. First on the list is traction. Traction alone can have a huge effect on quarter mile times and has nothing to do with horsepower. Gearing is another big factor. Some of us may remember a time when you could order cars with hugely varying gear ratios. These ratios had a huge effect on quarter mile times. For example, a 383 Roadrunner was about a full second quicker with 410 gears than it was with the far more common 323s. This factor is somewhat reduced on newer cars because they have more gears, but it's still a factor. Next on the list is driver skill. This is a big one and it's very tough to account for. Even the same driver in the same car on the same day will sometimes run a 14.9 in one run and then a 14.1 in the next. Another big one is the actual power curve. Just because a car has 200 peak horsepower doesn't mean that it has that much power at every point in the RPM range. It doesn't. As an extreme example, suppose we had a 124 with 300 horsepower at 3,500 RPM, but it tapered off in this case to 200 from 5,000 RPM and up. That 300 horsepower would have no effect in the quarter mile because the only time the car would be at 3,500 RPM would be in the first 60 feet in first gear when it's traction limited anyway. Obviously, that's an extreme fictional example, but the principle is valid. Now here's a dyno chart from my own car. This isn't quite the configuration we ran at the drags, but it's darn close. In this case, you can see that it has peak power in the low 190s, but from about 4,500 to 5,100, it's in the 170s. All these factors add up. So all these power numbers based on quarter mile calculations are accurate for calculating a minimum power requirement. They're at best just a rough guess when trying to calculate actual power based on a quarter mile time. By the way, that red line on the dyno chart, or those two red lines, are from the exact same car run on this dyno in two-wheel drive mode, simulating a lower tech dyno. I have a whole video on that subject on this channel. Back to the subject of drag racing, a competing car, which is running a manual transmission 124 Abarth with a competitor's tune on it, and a result from a dyno of 182 wheel horsepower, stock turbo and gasoline, did 14.8 in the quarter mile at Mission Raceway near Vancouver, and its corrected time is no better. Since the competing car ran a stock time with 180 wheel horsepower tune, does that mean that it's really only putting out stock power? Of course not. There were likely some variables that stacked against it on that particular day. Of course, I'm not privy to what those were. Sometime later, this same car went back to the drags and set a 14.1 time, which is smoking fast. To get that time, it had many additional mods added, including bigger injectors, a big turbo, bigger intercooler, high-flow catalytic converter, and more. It ran on E85, not gasoline, and used a 5,000 RPM launch. Using the same correction methods I used for my time, this time corrects to 14.2. I think that considering the fact that my car is an automatic, doesn't have limited slip, my 14.4 compares quite favorably with this. In the configuration used for these times, my car dyno's at 199 wheel horsepower, again that's a peak number, and the competing big turbo E85 car at 208. The big difference is that my car has only production bits on it, which are fully tested and which are proven in the marketplace and available. My car did its time on pump gasoline, specifically 91 octane gasoline from Quick Trip, which is a low-cost outfit in Tulsa. And all the mods on my car are relatively easy to install. As I said at the beginning of this thread, I don't expect this video to end any debate, and I don't think of the 124 as a drag race car, but it is a fun car at the drags, and with the right mods, it's pretty quick. Thanks for watching. Please leave comments below. I answer all of them. Have a great day.